Hello everyone, this is a plug for a conference that Augustine College is holding at Pepperdine University, October 20th to 25th. It's going to be on the question of evidence-based medicine, which applies more broadly to the university as well. You can find details at cmda.org. As is our wont, it will be more relaxed than many conferences, which allows you to make many more friendships. I hope to see you there. It's that time of year when students are back in school for the first time in many cases and for the nth time in many others. The probability of a Christian student going back to church after university, according to Pew, is not very high, depending on which study you look at, somewhere around 20%. Not good news. So I want to talk about that problem, which I faced as well, so I have some personal experience of it. So let's start with a short prayer, since we're talking specifically about Christian students today. O Lord, we know that you care for us and that you allow us all sorts of learning experiences, that you have no needs, but you have prepared many things for us to do because we need to do them. Help us to think carefully about how we go about the task of discipleship for Christ's sake. One of the things that I wished I'd known before I got to university, and I didn't learn till very much later. My fault, of course. There's quite a lot of them, but the fundamental one is reductionism. I was turned into a reductionist within a few weeks of arriving at medical school. I went straight from high school to medical school. You could do that way back in the 50s if you had been to a very good school, which I had. The word reductionism was never used, but it was fundamental. The assumption was that you could do everything you needed to do without any reference to God. He was an unnecessary encumbrance for many and downright irrational for many others. There aren't so many of those people around today, especially in the sciences, because of what we have discovered during my lifetime has not made it harder, but made it much easier to defend the idea that we are creatures. But way back in the 50s, that was not the case. So I was fascinated by science, and without thinking about it, I was slowly pushed towards the way that science would provide all the answers, which, of course, it cannot do. One of my favourite descriptions of the Christian life is Anselm's, way back. He said, the Christian life is faith-seeking understanding. Augustine said something quite similar when he wrote Credo ut intelligam, which, being translated, means, I believe in order to understand. If I'm just an animal, I function on instincts and learned reflexes. They do not have an abstract world. Teaching them to respond to certain symbols and calling that language is naive in the extreme. But we do have an abstract world, whether we like it or not. You could not bring up your children without the word ought. You ought to do that. You ought not to do that. But most often we leave out the ought. We just say do it or don't. But maybe we should put the ought in a bit more. So to sow that seed of what Peter Crave calls oughtedness, a gift from God that the animals don't have. They have reflexes. Your dog doesn't love you. He knows that you're the source of food, and that if he does certain things, he gets more food, or he gets more petting, or whatever it is that he likes. That's pure conditioned reflexes. Now, you can do that with children successfully up until about the age of 7. One of the guys I admired most as a teacher was a complete behaviourist, which is surprising given how intelligent he was. I mean, Skinner was right and wrong at the same time. Yes, we're all conditioned into certain ways of behaviour. That's something that the people who are currently rightly fussing about immigration, are there sustainable rates? Are there unsustainable rates? What are the causes of the problems that arise? They're all cultural. Don't use the word racism. It's irrelevant. You can't start talking about racism without accusing somebody else of being a racist. It leads nowhere. But culture doesn't. Culture is what matters in terms of how a society works. So I arrived in medical school with a set of Judeo-Christian norms which I took for granted and didn't think about at all. You might be blessed by having a similar upbringing. Because we had no television, the BBC was still a very good service provider. Both Sally, my wife, and I can remember running home from school in order to get home to listen to Children's Hour, where superb readers of children's books brought them to life for us day by day, a phenomenon that modern students don't know in the same way, although the need for it is very clear. The Lord of the Rings is a book that virtually all young people still enjoy. What many of them don't know is it was a near thing, because when Tolkien sent it off to Matthew Arnold's publishing company, all his clever academic readers said, they dismissed it as worthless. It was only because he gave it to his teenage son who said, "Dad, this is the best book I've ever read." And that's why he published it. His son, of course, was responding to what it means to be a human teenager. Well, the critics are simply being snobbish, and they hated the fact that they were wrong, unless they're totally disrespectful of everybody else. But of course, the reason those stories work is the reason biblical stories work, because we have receptors in our minds for stories which we wish we had for other things. There's so many stories you all have in your minds that a trigger can start off, and that's one of the joys of family gatherings, isn't it? It's that little triggers set up. Do you remember when we did X or Y or Z or whatever? And the stories fall out. And then you'll argue about the details, of course, because we all see those stories from slightly different ways. But the narratives survive. That's the amazing thing about Christ. Jesus told stories. He never worked from a script that he had spent hours and hours preparing. He worked from a mind that had spent hours and hours in the presence of his Father. And so he didn't need notes. And I imagine that no crowd let him off with less than an hour or two. And I think on occasions he probably went for longer than that. It's one of the great gifts of being a Christian. When you've travelled quite a lot, as I have, and you get asked to do more than you should be on some days. But I learned quite early on that was also something for which I should be grateful. And of course, that's when I learned a little bit more about the nature of what one was called to do, because I think one of the best talks I ever gave was at the end of a long day. You Americans in particular can work people quite hard. I think I can't remember how many talks I'd given that day, but it was surgeons, physicians, hospital chaplains, some lawyers, a homeschooling group, and students. So it was quite a day. I finished about 9 o'clock at night. When the last talk was due, I didn't have a lot of energy left. But the talk was excellent. And I very much had the sense that I was being supported. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and said, "I had the distinct sense that someone was standing next to you during that talk." And I said, "I can believe that." And I told her how tired I was, and I was astonished how smoothly it went. It wasn't me. I was merely being used in a very good way, a privilege of being used. And our world is hungry for this kind of reality. Jesus tells us, just go and tell what I've done in your life. That's all you have to do. So back to the main course. I arrived at university from a home where my mother's one of her greatest pleasures was to manage to get our little Brethren Chapel to get some missionaries to come and stay. And her greatest pleasure would be to provide some hospitality. So we had many missionaries for Sunday tea. And I was a little boy who was fascinated by what people had done. So they had an immense impact on me. They had seen and done things which a reductionist wouldn't accept. But these were honest people. They were not lying. And of course, it's happened to our family in our lifetime. We know that world exists. We are not alone in the universe. We are creatures. And the Creator is both merciful and good. That's our story. And I went from that very humble home, working class home, directly to medical school. And I was bored for most of the time because I had to do bits of medicine I had no interest in. But I was interested in the science, which we were constantly being taught was the real basis of medicine. And of course, that's a very limited view of what medicine is about. But I didn't know that. So my world had been cut down. It had previously been very wide. Tolkien, since we've already mentioned The Lord of the Rings, my favourite scene in The Lord of the Rings is when Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli had run across the plains chasing the orcs who'd kidnapped Merry and Pippin. They don't rescue them, but they realise that things have moved on and they're still alive, and they're resting in the grass wearing their elven cloaks. When Éomer from Rohan rides up with his horsemen, they just killed a whole bunch of orcs, which was why Merry and Pippin had survived. Times were bad, so Éomer's job was to kill any unwanted entrants into the land, and those that were apparently good had to go to Edoras, the capital, to be interviewed. Very modern sounding. And Aragorn says to Éomer, surrounded by these knights with spears on horses, just three people, Éomer tells him what he has to do, and Aragorn says, we're not going to do it, because we are going to go after our friends and find out what has happened, and we will fight you. And Éomer shows his wisdom. He's already realized this is no normal situation. So he's thinking about it. And then Aragorn says, good and evil are not one thing amongst men and another amongst dwarves and elves, and it is a man's part to discern them. And Éomer is wise enough to let him go. He had the wisdom. That, of course, is left out of the film because Jackson has no sense of this world of moral reality. So that's what's at risk when you get to university. What I was indoctrinated into was something it was going to take me many years to realize. I'd been cooking for a long while. In another talk, I would take it back to 1277. If you want to find out more, you can find it somewhere on my website or whatever. Anyway, but the bottom line, the turning point for me was when experimentation entered into the Western world. Various people, of course, necessarily along the way had done experiments, had worked out some mathematics and done some practical exercises. The great Archimedes did some amazing ones. But it hadn't become, if you like, a way of thinking as it is for us now. So all the universities were founded, that we call universities, all trace their roots back to around the 12th century when the Roman Catholic Church established the first universities in Bologna, shortly afterwards Paris and Oxford and Cambridge, early universities. And they were all under the control of the local bishop. And so that was just the way things were. And in the century before the experiments got going, Thomas Aquinas had written the most amazing material that the Western world has seen in theological terms from a single pen. And what had driven him on was the rediscovery of Greek learning being brought into Europe via Spain, having been cared for basically by the Muslims. That's a great gift to us. But the bishop was worried about what this was doing because the logic that had been produced by Aristotle, he worried it might undermine the faith of the humble poor. So he said, we need to think about this. So he said to the people, it was the Bishop of Paris, he said, You can't go along that route yet. We need to look at this material and see whether it is safe for the ordinary people. Very, what's the word I want? Well, shepherdly is what he would think of it himself, but somewhat arrogant is probably what we would say today. And it never was really looked at, but it meant for a little while they had at least to pretend they weren't using Aristotelian deductive logic. And that forced them to do much more inductive reasoning. Now, if your children are going to university, they will be taught that science is the deductive system, hypothetico-deductive, they say. But it's not, it's inductive. But they know that if they accept that, they've accepted a lot more. I think they know intuitively. Some of them know deep down and won't express it. But you think what you're doing when you do an experiment. You have an idea, usually. You don't start by looking at things and then deduce what's going to happen and then do an experiment. No, it's almost important experiments happen the other way around. You intuitively say, that's interesting. I wonder what's going on. How could we look at it? You start arguing from what you've just seen. So inductive reasoning takes what you can actually see and understand and tries to build up the other way. It doesn't start from huge concepts of truth. They're all background acceptance. But in order to do an experiment and believe that you'll get the same answer in London as you would in Ottawa or New York or wherever you are, that's an immense act of faith, but totally acceptable to Christians who were the inhabitants of the university at that time, because God is an ordered God, not an arbitrary God. The Muslims say that Allah is not bound by any rules at all. The Christians know that God has a character and he will not deny himself. And what we know about it, he's taught us all the way through by inspiration, that he's good, that he's compassionate, that he cares for us, and that he's in charge. So, and he's an orderly God. He talks to Job about, look around, how it's all made. Were you there when I did that? And Job is humbled. We ought to be humbled by science. And scientists talking over dinner or in the bar don't use the words they have in their publications. They talk about how amazing it is, how elegant, how cool. Very emotional words, but never appear in the final text. It's astonishing sometimes when you read your own work and it's all very nicely done in the way it's supposed to be done. You say, but it wasn't actually anything like that. We're lovely to write papers as they actually happened and how they emerged, but you never get them published. But that's the reality that makes an experiment worthwhile. I had to go to Africa to learn how important it was, because Africa is populated by new Christians, much more than we're Christian, but still living in a pagan means of understanding. And I'm not using pagan as pejorative, merely as descriptive. A pagan world is one in which the arbitrary events of everyday life are expressed in terms of spirit power, good and evil, mainly evil. But they're local. So there's no reason to think that something happens in one place would also happen in another. I was privileged to do a lot of work that had applications in the developing world for malnourished children. And we solved the problem. But it didn't transpose. It didn't move into the culture of Africa. So when some 10 years after we'd published the work, I went to Africa somewhat against my will to see why it wasn't working, or at least to try. And of course, I didn't work it out at all. But I was given a gift. I trained my children to resuscitate malnourished children in a mud hut just to show that it could be done. And they did it, not as well as we would do it with all the modern facilities we had in Jamaica. But they could do it. Whereas children could stay in care of mission hospitals even, and it wasn't happening because the whole concept had not been transmitted in the West and was not transmissible to a pagan culture. When one of the nurses I had trained to identify malnourished children early on, when it's easy to correct it, had his own child die of malnutrition, when traced back as to why he died, he thought that his child's appetite had been taken away by an evil spirit. So he had spent his money on the witch doctor and the child had died. When I said, well, if I'd fed him, what would have happened? He said, he'd have got better. But the reason was not because of the way I organised the food, it was because of the strength of my spirit. It's very hard to overcome that way of looking at the world, because evil spirits make much more sense of living in Central Africa than a God of love does at first sight. And yet the church is growing there, and joyfully so. But not being taught, not being disciplined, not being discipled. Now, I went to university inadequately trained for the world that had developed, and we hadn't really realized how reductive it had become. That word reductionism needs some considerable discussion. I keep meaning to say more about it. I do, but I'll do a bit more today. It came about, in my view, around the 14th century when the first experiments were done in Merton College, Oxford. And fortunately, one of the people in Oxford at the time was a man called William of Ockham. Ockham's a place just outside. Sorry, so you see it's spelled two ways, O-C-C-A-M, which hides the truth. O-C-K-H-A-M is what it would actually be. You still see that in appropriate places. And he was a Franciscan, and Oxford was largely Franciscan. And he was watching these experiments, and he was smart enough to realize the implications. He saw that we were going to understand things not in terms of theology, but in terms of practicalities, that God was going to be, in some sense, sidelined. Not a good idea. And so he tried to help God out, which he should never do. He doesn't need any help. Obedience is all that's required. But he pulled apart the things that could not be measured from the things that could, because he saw that this new science was all about measurement. So much so now you have bureaucrats, especially if you're in medicine, who don't accept as important anything they can't measure. And they don't even know the statistics they ought to use for the measurements they're misusing. But to think of one of the major costs in medicine is diabetes, combined with obesity, which aggravates both that and helps to cause hypertension. So obesity, hypertension and diabetes are a major source of expenditure in the health system. But the fundamental problem is not scientific. No one in the world can gain weight without food. Even Prader-Willi children who have no appetite control, whilst you can keep lock and key on food, you can keep them at a proper weight because you provide the appetite substitute. But they're always hungry. But so many people today are using food as a means of, mollifying the anxieties and all the vagaries of life. Genetically endowed, as their weight goes up, they're going to get diabetes. Now, the bureaucrats only want measurements, so they insist that the doctor measures the average sugar over time, which is glycosylated hemoglobin is a substitute for that. Measure the blood pressure and weigh the patient. As long as that is done, they get their money. And if the sugar is up, you increase the sugar-lowering drugs, which, of course, increases the appetite. And if the blood pressure is up, you give them more of the drugs to bring the blood pressure down. But the fundamental problem is at the level of the psyche, the soul. If you increase the drugs to lower the blood sugar, well, appetite increases, so the weight goes up. It's a vicious cycle. And it can't be broken by any of the things that the bureaucrats measure and count as a evidence of good medicine. Good medicine requires, in that situation, at least finding the ones who, with some help, can change their lifestyle and get some control. But you will get paid for that. That's what we've got to in our reduction. That's reductionism working its way through in a very practical way. So when you go to the doctor, if you're overweight, hypertensive and diabetic, you are being abused by reductionism. Whereas what you need is a change of lifestyle and therefore a community and people who can help you with your problem. I mean, the problem is very small in measurement terms. If you gain 10 kilograms in 10 years, that means storing about 15 calories a day instead of burning. So if your problem is of the order of 15 calories, why do we have all this stuff going on? You'd think it would be easy. Yeah, no, you still have body weight control mechanisms even when you're overweight. They're just a little offset. It doesn't need to be much to grow into a huge problem. But it's not going to be solved by the reductive methods that are being forced on doctors. And those that try to do it properly, not only do they not get paid, they often get punished. That's reductionism. You cannot reduce everything to biochemistry. The old saw is that all biology is chemistry, all chemistry is physics, all physics is mathematics, and all mathematics is nonsense, so give up. I'll leave you to sort that one out. So I had no understanding of what was going on. I became a problem solver in a reductive way, and I was good at it. It can be years before I learned to understand that. So, unfortunately, I don't know of a way to teach this that really works. But at least, hopefully, I've opened your minds. One book that you could read that would help, although it doesn't talk about reductionism, is J. Brzezinski's What We Can't Not Know. He starts at the other end, pointing out that something like the Ten Commandments are known to be true by everyone in some form or other. And that's a defense against reductionism. The Ten Commandments are God's recipe for a culture that will survive and flourish. Absence those points, they will have a very finite life. We are post-Christian now, certainly in our culture, in our politics, in our policy making. You have a few wonderful people like Tom Sowell, who is a reductionist in the way that he approaches economics, but he understands the context and he can talk about it in terms of his own life. So that's the first thing that your children, grandchildren, and the like, currently entering university, it's not going to be talked about. It's just going to be assumed, and it gets into your blood, so to speak. So what are the ways that we can help them to avoid this problem? Well, over the years, I did start thinking about this, and I realized that one of the reasons I did better than many of the others was that I had learnt the scriptures. And so one of the first things you should encourage your children to do is to join a Bible reading group of some sort. The Bible is in all our literature. We just don't recognize it anymore. So it gives moral structure. Everybody's views are not equally valid. Your truth and my truth, relativism, is nonsense. It leads nowhere in the long run because there are no oughts and you cannot run society without ought. Peter Crave's book, A Refutation of Moral Relativism, for the older generation, and the best things in life is probably the one to read for the younger generation. So you start with reductionism, it feeds into relativism, all four forms. It leads to inappropriate tolerance. I would begin my class by, in honours biochemistry, a small class. I made sure it was small, I didn't like marking. But I would begin by saying, you'll find me to be an intolerant professor. And of course you could see the body language immediately. And I say, hang on a minute before you get mad with me. And then I would make them think their way through a problem which could not be solved if moral relativism was true. I usually took a very politically incorrect one of asking them whether they knew what NAMBLA was. They never did. And I said, well, it's the North American Man-Boy Love Association, and it's declared public objective in those days. I don't know whether it still is. I haven't looked for a while. It was to legalize sodomy between adult men and pre-pubertal boys on the grounds that done by a caring adult, it was an enjoyable experience for the boys. And I asked them whether they would allow a member of NAMBLA into their house to do that. And of course, no one would. I said, welcome to the ranks of the intolerant. A society survives because of what it will not tolerate, not what it will. Tolerance is not even a virtue. It's the oil to make the machinery work when you've only got poor sinners to work it, because we all need some tolerance. It doesn't make it right. You can't use tolerance as a verb in relation to something good. You don't tolerate love. It's the wrong verb, isn't it? You tolerate a little bit of cheating. You tolerate a little bit of theft, a little bit of gossip, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's not good. We need something like that because we're all in need of help in that direction. But we ought to acknowledge what we're doing. We would like to be better than we are. That's a long process. And the church used to teach, and certainly the early apostles did, how to do that. And we've forgotten. I often misquote scripture when I'm preaching in order to get attention. And I'll say, why do you think the epistles were written? Nobody comes up with an answer immediately. And I say, well, they were written because in every situation, people were not living as they should. And in Corinthians, the church was disordered sexually. In Thessalonians, they had the wrong view of work, and so he goes on. So Paul writes letters to disordered churches to get them straightened out. And he will say something like this. If you have followed my argument, because all his epistles have about 80% theology, and then the ethics is so simple you couldn't make a course out of it. He says, if you understand this, then you're going to love your spouse, love your children, and pay your servants. That's about it. And so he says, if you follow my argument, then you ought not to be like the people around you. You need to be renewed in your feelings, made more joyful. But of course, that isn't what he said. He said you ought to be renewed in your mind, which is your reasonable service. Applied Christianity is a thinking person's religion. Those that think make progress, and they have joy at a deep level. Martin Lloyd-Jones is a wonderful example for me, but he was a very somber and serious preacher. He didn't set out to entertain. He could grab your attention and hold it for an hour, but it wasn't entertaining. Now churches, praise teams think they're more important than anybody else, but if I had my way, the praise would come after confession, repentance, creed, and sermon, because then you might have something to sing about. But to try and work somebody up into a state of emotional joy, pop stars can do that better than we do in the short term. That's not what it's about. Every epistle is about working out your own salvation with fear and trembling. So that's what's needed. As far as your children going off to university are concerned, I would encourage you to get a little group around them. Probably not. You're going to be there for them anyway, but people they know and respect, half a dozen of them would be a good number, so that one of them each week would call them and say, have you taken time to read your Bible this week? Have you prayed this week? Have you been to church? Have you had fellowship with other Christians? Have you just lied to me? That gives them a chance to be honest about the fact they're already losing their way. And then you can pray with them over the phone. You can keep them going. I was kept going for a time by a lovely couple who I met just as I graduated, and I was looking after the wife. And she looked at my life in hospital. She was in for about a week, and she said, where do you get any time off? Well, in those days we didn't get any. You had a week to look after patients without being on call, and then either 3 or 4 days on call, and the cycle went on. So the only breaks you got were in the non-call period. You could get one of your colleagues to look after your patients if there's no trouble going on, and you could go out for a bit. And so what they did was every now and again, Mrs. Broad would call her husband and say, Esmond, call John, see if you can get off for a meal. Because he worked in the city, drove past the hospital gates on the way home, and he'd pick me up. They would feed me and comfort me, so to speak, in the best sorts of ways. They never probed. They were just hospitable. And that kept me going for a year or so. That was the only Christian context I had during that year. So medicine in particular undermines your faith at the time when you need it. You see, there are certain questions which everyone has to answer. Where did I come from? question of origins. Are we the products of time plus chance? Or is there a creator? Who or what banged is the way one physicist put it. I think that's rather nice. Who or what banged? Aristotle, who understood the problem logically, said, well, matter must be eternal, but we know it isn't. So Aristotle had a rational way of dealing with it, and he built a logical system from that. But that's not available to us in the same way, because we don't ask about premises. And this is something else you have to train your children to do. What are you assuming when you say X or Y? I have a grandson who's just completed law school. I asked him, what did you learn about the philosophy of law? He said, we don't even have to take a course. You can if you want to. I didn't. Law is just about procedure. Well, procedure was what they did in Soviet Russia, and they killed millions of people legally. The Psalms are full of the cries for justice, even in a Judaic system. Injustice was common. It always has been. It always will be. The powerful always abuse their power because they're fallen creatures just like you and me. So justice falls by the wayside quite easily. It's a miracle when it doesn't. Common law is a miracle because it takes it back to ordinary people making decisions about particular cases. The liberal elite want to codify law. They want to give it all to a central body of clever people who lecture us on how much carbon dioxide we're producing, and then they drive their private jets all around the world to have conferences about what they're going to tell us next. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. And the science, of course, is incredible in the old sense of the word. So, first they need to have been brought up to know the stories. Second, they need to continue in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship and prayers, breaking of bread. Those are not optional extras, Acts 2:42. They are the means to keep your life on track. If you do them together, you will survive. You break down on those four, and the trouble is inevitable. We ought to accept that and make the effort to do what that implies. We can't not do them and expect everything to be okay. That would mean there was no moral consequence in the world, and there is. So they must learn to cope with that. That is an incredible start. They've got to be able to say, I believe there are such things as real truth. That copes with epistemological relativism. And I believe that there are real ways to handle sexuality properly. And the evidence is there if you go look. And even the Canadian government publishes data showing that the best outcome for children is when they have a mum and a dad who stay together. Nobody else comes close. Amazingly, homosexual men produce better children than homosexual women. Statistically, that's what the Canadian data shows. Divorce, of course, is 50% now, isn't it, or thereabouts? And it's worse than that because most kids shack up first now. And that's not a good idea either. So your children in university, if they're not talking about these things, the silence is as much as the language. And you've got to help them to see what's at stake. Those of you who like novel reading, Wendell Berry's Port William novels do it in retrospect, so to speak. He's looking back over 100 years in Kentucky. And the first one in the series, Watch With Me, is a love story between a farmer and the village teacher in the days of the one-room schoolroom. And he comes all the way through to the modern period. And he simply describes what is happening, and he's not happy about it. He's also written what I think is the most challenging and beautiful book addressing moral relativism in relation to how we handle human life, which is going to be a big problem for anybody doing medicine. Life is a Miracle is a stunning book. Only Wendell Berry could write a pro-life book, starting with a whole chapter on King Lear. It's full of amazing writing. I love, for instance, one of his analogies. He said, you lower into the well of life your bucket, but that bucket will only pull up what it's capable of pulling up. So if you put a reductionistic bucket into the well of life, you only pick up what can be measured. And yet you can only live with the things that can't be measured. Love, justice, honour, truth. We're giving children inadequate equipment to make sure they hold on to the important things. This didn't turn out quite as I wished. I'll probably continue it next week, but I hope I get some feedback, because feedback is incredibly useful.